In my home, when I was growing up, my family, like many others, had a tradition associated with the celebration of Christmas. On Christmas Eve, we kids were allowed to open one present chosen for us by our parents. Sometimes it was to whet our appetites for what was to come, while in other years, especially as we grew older, it was something that would allow us to better appreciate the season. It is in this spirit that I would like to offer you, our listeners, this supplemental episode of the Scientific Odyssey. Think of it as a gift from us to you, something a little different than our usual narrative and biography to add a bit of spice to the season. In 1634, Ludwig Kepler and Jacob Bartsch published a posthumous work by Ludwig's father Johannes Kepler, known as the Somnium, or in English, the Dream. The elder Kepler had begun work on the book as early as his years as a theological student in Tübingen around 1593, and had worked on it on and off throughout his life. It seems to have originally been a disputation defense of Copernican astronomy, wherein Kepler attempted to show how the Earth would be seen to move when viewed from the moon, which then evolved from there into something else. He likely shared the manuscript, or at least parts of it, with friends and associates over the years, but never committed it to print for a variety of reasons. Eventually, one of these manuscript copies passed out of his control in around 1611 and caused a great deal of concern on Kepler's part, as he feared it might have been used as a piece of evidence in the witchcraft trial against his mother. 4 years after his death, Johannes' son and son-in-law published the work, and its subject became known to the wider world. It was a semi-fictional story that combined both serious scientific ideas with autobiographical elements and Nordic and Germanic mythology to create what some have called the first piece of science fiction literature in the Western tradition. The evaluation of this claim is a bit complicated and more in the realm of literary scholarship, but we do know that Kepler was strongly influenced by the Roman writer Lucian and used the author's work as a primer for learning Greek along with that of Plutarch, who had a scientific treatise known as the Face of the Moon. The subject of Lucian's writing in this case was a war between a race of people on the moon and a race of people on the sun, and it satirically examined classical and Roman culture and offered alternative ways of thinking about social institutions. While this sort of re-examination of norms is a hallmark of much modern science fiction, Lucian's work lacks any sort of realistic view of the heavens and thus is discounted by some. Kepler, on the other hand, takes great pains to develop plausible means of propulsion and incorporates detailed descriptions of the real physical systems, and so is more closely aligned with how we perceive the genre today. What follows here is a full reading of the text of the story. However, before we get to that, there are a few notes to be made. First, the Latin text for the first edition of the book ran some 25 pages, followed by over 50 pages of clarifying notes associated with the astronomical and scientific ideas. Kepler had originally planned to publish it with new translations of both Lucian and Plutarch, but never seems to have got around to it before his passing in 1630. We'll only include the text of the work itself in this episode. Second, there is a need to clarify a few of the names Kepler gives things. In the story, the moon is called Lavania, which is pretty straightforward. The moon, however, is divided into two parts, subvulva and prevulva. This is less straightforward until you realize that due to the orbital dynamics of the moon's motion around the Earth, it is what astronomers call tidally locked in a one-to-one resonance with the Earth. This means that it more or less keeps the same face pointed towards the Earth at all times as it rotates on its axis at the same rate it revolves around the Earth. In the Somnium, the Earth is known to the inhabitants of Lavania as vulva, and so subvulva is the hemisphere of the moon that is always facing the Earth, while prevulva is the hemisphere that always faces away. Third, the story begins as something of a fanciful mythological narrative, but once our protagonist leaves the Earth, it shifts into something much closer to Kepler's early disputation defense. In other words, a scientific discussion of what astronomical observations one could make of the heavens from the moon. This can all get a bit technical, but is manageable enough that we've chosen to include it here. Finally, as we'll see, the story comes to a very abrupt conclusion. There are several hypotheses as to why this happens, but the best that I've come across is that Kepler had originally planned to write a good bit more about the society and politics of the peoples that inhabited Lavinia. But as the tensions surrounding the conflict between the forces of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation spiraled towards outright warfare, that combined with his own negative experience surrounding his mother's trial caused him to decide to shelve those plans lest his commentary get him or his loved ones into even more hot water. Unfortunately, for both him and all of Europe, things on that front never improved enough for him to be able to pick it back up. Moving forward in history, it is thought that this work was known to and read by both H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, and thus likely had a profound influence on the development of their works of science fiction, as well as of others, including Arthur C. Clarke. As we conclude our introductory remarks, our translation from Latin is taken in part from the Somnium project of Tom Metcalfe. We want to offer Tom our thanks for allowing us to use his work here and encourage you to head over to his site, somniumproject.wordpress.com, to take a look, especially if you've got some familiarity with Latin. Other sections are from the Nexum Indicione translation. We here at the Scientific Odyssey hope you enjoy this presentation. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 23.1, Supplemental-The Somnium. In the year 1608, when discord raged between the brothers Emperor Rudolph and Archduke Matthias, precedents for their actions were sought and commonly revived from Bohemian history. Excited by this public curiosity, I gave my attention to the legends of Bohemia. When I came to the story of their heroine Labusa, so celebrated in the magical arts, something happened that night. After contemplating the stars and the moon, I settled into bed and fell into a deep sleep. But in my dreams, I seemed to be reading through a book that I had brought from the market. This was the tenor of the book. My name is Duracotus. My country is Iceland, called Thule by the ancients. The recent death of my mother, Foxahild, has freed me to write as I have long wished. But while my mother lived, she would not let me write. Indeed, she said, there were many destructive people who hated such arts because their dull minds could not grasp them. So they misrepresented the arts and made laws injurious to the human race. Certainly, not a few of those condemned to die by such laws have been swallowed up by the chasms of Hekla. My mother never told me my father's name. She said he was a fisherman who died at the age of 150 years, when I was 3 years old, and after he had been married for about 70 years. Since my earliest childhood, my mother had dragged me by the hand or lifted me onto her shoulders to take me to the lower slopes and peaks of Hekla, especially near the feast of St. John, when the sun can be seen for all 24 hours, and gives no ground to the night. There she collected many herbs, which she cooked at home with many household spells. With these concoctions, she filled small bags made from goatskin, and took them to the nearby port to sell to the captains of the ships. In this way, she earned her living. Once, out of curiosity, I cut one of the bags open, and my mother sold it without knowing. The herbs, grasses, and strips of linens embroidered with colorful charms spilled out. Cheated of her small profit, my mother, inflamed with rage, left me with the master of the ship in place of the bag until she could bring another, while she kept the money. The next morning, the captain suddenly set sail from port, on a lucky wind bound for Bergen in Norway. After several days, a north wind rose that drove us between England and Norway, and the captain steered for the narrow straits near Denmark, because he had letters from the Icelandic bishop to be delivered to the Dane Tycho Brahe, who lived on the island of Hvin. I was unused to the hot weather, and the rocking of the ship made me very sick, because I was just a 14-year-old boy. When the ship reached the coast, I was put ashore in the home of an island fisherman and left with the letters. And promising to return, the captain set sail again. When I delivered the letters, Brahe began to ask me many excited questions. But I knew few words of his language and could not understand him. So Brahe instructed his students, whom he supported in great numbers, to speak with me again and again, and through Brahe's generosity, with a few weeks of practice, I began to speak in Danish fairly well. I was no less willing to talk than they were to question me, for I wondered about many unfamiliar things, while I told them new things about my country. In time, the ship's captain returned to Hvin, but Brahe refused to let him take me back, which made me more than happy. I took a wonderful delight in the practice of astronomy. Brahe and his students watched the moon and constellations all night with marvelous instruments. These activities reminded me of my mother. In fact, she had had a constant habit of talking to the moon. In this way, although I came from a half-barbaric country and a poor home, I gained knowledge of the most sacred science which has set me on the road to greater things. After many years on the island of Hvin, at last I longed to see my homeland again. I reasoned that it would not be hard for me, with the science that I had acquired, to rise to some importance among my ignorant people. After receiving his blessing to depart, I said farewell to Brahe and came to Copenhagen. There I found traveling companions, who willingly undertook to protect me for the sake of my knowledge of the language and the region. And so I returned to my native land 5 years after I had left. My first joy on my return was to find my mother still alive and practicing the same trade as before. I put an end to her long-lasting sorrow, for the sake of the son she had lost through recklessness, now brought home alive and distinguished. At that time, the year was turning to autumn, and those long nights of ours were drawing near. For the month of Christmas, the sun barely rises a little at midday, and then turns back on its traces out of sight. Therefore, my mother was free from her work. She stayed close and did not leave me, wherever I went with the letters of recommendation I had received, asking at times about the lands I had visited, at times about the heavens. She was delighted with any science that I had learned, and compared what she knew with my explanations. She declared that she was now ready to die, since she was leaving behind a son to inherit the knowledge that only she possessed. By nature, I am passionate to learn new things, and so I asked in turn about her arts, and of those who are considered masters of those arts among the people, far apart from the others. Then one day she chose the time to talk about everything she recalled, from the very beginning. She spoke as follows. Sight is granted, Duracotus, my son, not only in the other provinces, where you have come from, but also here in our homeland. Even though we are beset by winter's cold and darkness and other discomforts that I only now understand after hearing from you about the good fortune of other countries, our ingenuity abounds. At our service are wise spirits who detest the light of other lands and the uproar of their peoples. They seek out our shadows and converse with us on friendly terms. Among them 9 are foremost. Of these, one is best known to me, the most gentle and kindest of all. He is summoned by 21 symbols. Through his power I am often transported, in an instant of time, to other shores, anywhere I ask. But if I be frightened by the distance, I learn as much by asking questions as if I were present there. Many of the things that you have seen with your own eyes, or have heard reported or taken from books, he recounted to me just as you have. He has spoken to me often of one place more than any other, a region of great wonder, which I want you to observe as my companion. And then she spoke the name, Lavinia. Without hesitation, I agreed that she should summon her teacher and question him. I prepared myself to listen to every detail of the account of the journey and the description of the region. Now, it was already spring. As soon as the sun was hidden below the horizon, the horns of the waxing crescent moon began to shine in conjunction with the planet Saturn in the sign of Taurus. At the nearest crossroads, my mother drew apart from me and, raising a shout, uttered just a few words. This ceremony completed, she came back, commanded silence with the outstretched palm of her right hand, and sat down beside me. Scarcely had we covered our heads with our cloaks, in accordance with the covenant, when we began to hear the rasping of a stammering and indistinct voice, which at once began to speak as follows, but in the Icelandic language. The island of Lavinia is located 50,000 German miles high up in the sky. The route to get there from here, or back to this earth, is rarely open. When it is open, it is easy for our kind, at least, to travel. But transporting humans is truly difficult, and risks the greatest dangers to life. We do not admit desk-bound humans into these ranks, nor the fat, nor the foppish. But we choose those who regularly spend their time hunting with swift horses, or those who voyage in ships to the Indies and are accustomed to living on hard bread, garlic, dried fish, and other abhorrent foods. The best adapted for the journey are dried-out old women, since from youth they are accustomed to riding goats at night, or pitchforks, or traveling the wide expanses of the earth in worn-down clothes. There are none in Germany who are suitable, but the dry bodies of Spaniards are not rejected. The whole journey, although far, is completed in a time of just 4 hours at the most. Never are we more busy than just before the time determined for our departure, when the eastern side of the moon begins to be eclipsed. For if the moon regains its full light while we are embarked upon the journey, it prevents our departure back to the moon. This occasion proves so narrow that we take few of the human race along, and none except the students of our order. Therefore, any person of this kind we all seize together, pushing him upwards to raise him high. First of all, he experiences a strong pressure, not unlike the explosion of gunpowder, as he is hurled above the mountains and the seas. For this reason, drugs and opium are consumed at the start, so that he falls asleep, and each of his limbs disentangled, so that his body is not torn from his legs, nor his head driven from his body, but so the shock will be distributed all across all his limbs. Next, he experiences new difficulties. It is intensely cold, and he cannot breathe. All of us are born with the power to relieve the cold. For his breathing, we push damp sponges up his nose to block the flow. With this first part of the journey accomplished, it is easy to set his trajectory. When we reach the open sky, we remove our hands from his body so that he balls himself up like a spider, which we transport almost by our will alone, so that finally the mass of the body falls downward towards the intended destination of its own accord. But for our own use, this impetus is not enough because it is extremely slow. We therefore impart an acceleration to the body and go ahead to allow no injuries from a hard impact with the moon. When they awake, humans usually complain of an indescribable exhaustion in all of their limbs, from which, much later, they recover enough to walk. It would take too long to recount the many additional difficulties that occur, but no great harm comes to us. We stay close within the shadow of the earth for as long as it lasts, and we are in hand when they arrive at Lavania. They descend just as from a ship to the land, and once there, we quickly withdraw to caves and shaded places, lest the sun overwhelm us in the open, and force us away from our chosen shelter to follow the receding shadow. When we are granted a period of rest in that place, we exercise our ingenuity to the best of our knowledge. We confer with other daemons of the same region and plan an alliance so that when the sunlight first begins to leave a region of space, we move in massed ranks into the shadow. For if the sharp point of the moon's shadow touches the earth, which often happens, our allied squadrons fall upon the earth. As long as men see the sun's eclipse, we cannot do otherwise. So it is that solar eclipses are so much feared. Such has been said of the journey to Lavania. Next I will speak of the nature of the place itself, beginning as geographers do with the things that happen in the heavens. Although the fixed stars appear everywhere in Lavania, the same as they do for us, nevertheless we see differences in the movements and the magnitudes of the planets to such degree that they have their entirely own system of astronomy. Therefore, as geographers divide our sphere of the earth into 5 zones according to their celestial phenomena, so is Lavania divided into 2 hemispheres. One of these is the subvolvan, and the other is the privolvan. The subvolvans are forever blessed by the light of our vulva, our earth, which for them takes the place of our moon. But the privolvans are eternally deprived any sight of the earth. The circle dividing their hemispheres, named the divisor, resembles the meridian passing through the solstices and poles of our world. Such things that are common to both hemispheres I will explain first. All Lavania experiences the same changes of day and night as we do, but without our annual variations throughout the year. For throughout Lavania, the days are almost equal to the nights, except for the privolvans. Each day is always shorter than the night, and for the subvolvans, longer. The changes through a cycle of 8 years will be described later. Under each of the poles, the night hangs in balance, the sun half covered, half alight, as it circles the mountains. To its inhabitants, Lavania appears to stand unmoving among the moving stars, no less than our earth appears to we humans. Their night and day together are equal to one of our month. When the sun is about to rise in the morning, almost an entire sign of the zodiac is more visible on the day after than on the day before. Just as in one of our years the sun transits 365 times, and the sphere of the fixed stars revolves 366 times, or more precisely, 1,461 suns in 4 years, but 1,465 revolutions of the fixed sphere, So for them, in 1 year, the sun transits 12 times, and the sphere of the fixed stars 13 times. Or more precisely, in 8 years, the sun transits 99 times, and the fixed sphere revolves 107 times. But a 19-year cycle is more familiar to them, for in that number of years, the sun rises 235 times, and the fixed stars 254 times. The sun rises on the central or innermost regions of the subvolvans when the last quarter appears to us. What I describe in the middle regions may be understood of all the semicircles through the poles and the center lines at right angles to the divisors. These could be called the metavolvan semicircles. The circle intermediate between the poles, in the place of the equator of our Earth, will be called by the same name. On two sides, the divisor and the metavolva intersect at opposite points. For every one underneath, the sun passes nearly overhead each day, and exactly overhead at noon on 2 opposite days of the year. For all the rest who live towards the poles, the sun declines from zenith at midday. On Lavania, they also have some summer and winter changes, but they are not to be compared with the variety of our own. Nor are they, as with us, in the same places at the same time of the year. For in the space of 10 years, at any given location, the summer changes from one part of the sidereal year to the opposite part. Therefore, in a 19 sidereal year cycle, or 235 lunar days, summer occurs 20 times near the poles, and winter as often, but 40 times beneath the equator. So for them, 6 summer days alike are months go by in every year, and the rest are winter. These changes are hardly sensed near the equator, because there the sun roams no more than 5 degrees back and forth on either side. It is much more evident near the poles, which alternately see the sun and see it not for 6 months at a time, as it is for those of us on the earth who live beneath either of the poles. Accordingly, the globe of Lavania, too, is divided into 5 zones, corresponding in certain ways to our terrestrial zone. But the torrid zone spans barely 10 degrees, as does the frigid zone. All of the remainder falls under the analogues to our temperate zones. The torrid zone crosses through the middle of the hemispheres, with half of its length through the subvulva and the remaining half through the privulva. From the intersections of the equatorial and zodiacal circles arise 4 cardinal points, just like our equinoxes and solstices, and the zodiacal circle commences at these intersections. But, as a consequence of this, the movement of the fixed stars is very swift, since, in 20 tropical years, which are defined as 1 summer and 1 winter, the entire zodiac passes by, which happens with us in nearly 26,000 years. So much for the first motion. The theory of the secondary movements is no less different for them than it is for us, while it is much more intricate. The reason is that in addition to the many irregularities shown by the 6 planets, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn, the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, they witness 3 more. 2 of them are in length, one daily, the second in a period of 8.5 years, the third of latitude in a 19-year cycle. For the middle Privulvians see the sun larger at noon than when it rises, while the Subvulvians see it smaller than upon rising. Both believe that the sun inclines towards the subvulva for a few minutes, back and forth from the ecliptic, and then among the fixed stars. These oscillations, as I have already said, go back to the starting point in a period of 19 years. Even so, this variation takes more time in the privulva and somewhat less in the subvulva. And although it is assumed that the sun and the fixed stars advance evenly around Lavania in its first movement, the sun hardly moves in relation to the stars for the privulva at noon, while it appears very fast for the subvulva, while the opposite is true for midnight. As a result, the sun seems to give daily jumps among the stars. The same is true in the case of Venus, Mercury, and Mars. These phenomena, however, are almost imperceptible for Jupiter and Saturn. In addition, the daily movement is not uniform every day at similar hours. On the contrary, it is sometimes slower, not only for the sun, but also for the fixed stars, and it becomes faster in the opposite part of the year at the same time. Moreover, this delay changes during the year, in such a manner that it now takes place on a summer's day and then on a winter's, completing the cycle in a period of less than 9 years. Hence, the day becomes sometimes longer than the night, because of a natural slowness, not, as it is the case on Earth, by an uneven section of the orbit on a calendar day, and sometimes the night, because of the natural slowness, not, as in the case of the Earth, by an uneven section of the orbit on a calendar day, and sometimes the night becomes longer. But if the delay lies above the privolva during the night, its excess on the day is increased. If, on the other hand, it happens during the day, then night and day are more evenly matched, something that only happens completely once every 9 years. And the opposite, of course, is true for the subvulva. So far for the common characteristics to both hemispheres. With regard to each hemisphere, separately, there is a great contrast between them. By its presence or absence, the vulva, our Earth, gives rise to very dissimilar spectacles. And not only that, but rather common phenomena differ greatly here and there in their effects. As a result, one could perhaps more correctly call the privolvian hemisphere intemperate and the subvulvian temperate. The night of the privolvians lasts for 15 or 16 of our days, terrible for its endless shadows, just like our nights with no moon. Not even the rays of the vulva cast their light upon them. For this reason, everything becomes frigid ice, spray, and is subject to the most powerful and fearsome winds. Then follows the day, as long as 14 of our days, or maybe a little less. During this time, the sun appears quite large, and moves slowly with respect to the fixed stars. There are no winds. As a result, the heat becomes unbearable. Thus, for the space of one of our months, or a day of Lavania, one same place is exposed to a heat 15 times higher than that of Africa, and a cold more unbearable than that of Quivira. It should be especially noted that the planet Mars is sometimes seen as almost twice as large of what we see it. This happens for those who live in the central parts of the privolva at midnight, and for the rest at the beginning of their own night. The subvulvian hemisphere. As we move into this hemisphere, I will start with their frontiermen, those who inhabit the dividing circle. Particular to them is the fact that the observed digressions of Venus and Mercury with respect to the Sun seem to them much greater than to us. Venus appears to them at certain times as double or greater than our vision of it, especially to those who live near the North Pole. But the most pleasant of all the visions in Lavania is the contemplation of the vulva. They enjoy the view of the vulva instead of our moon, of which both the privolvians and themselves completely lack. Due to the perennial presence of the vulva, this region is called subvulva, as the other one is called privolva, because it has been deprived of its view of the same. When our moon rises full and travels over houses and distant mountains, the inhabitants of the earth see it as a circle of a large wooden barrel. When it rises to the middle of the sky, it brings to mind something resembling the shape of a human face. But for the subvolvians, their vulva, our Earth, when it occupies the middle of the sky, the vulva takes this position for those who live in the center of this hemisphere, it acquires a diameter slightly less than 4 times more than that of our moon. So if we make a comparison between these disks, the surface of the vulva is 15 times greater than our moon. For those whom the vulva continually rubs the horizon, it appears in the form of a distant burning mountain. Just as we tell apart our regions by means of their higher or lower elevations in relation to the pole, although we do not necessarily see the pole with our own eyes, so the altitude of this ever-present vulva meets the same need for them, since it is always visible and varies in altitude in different places. While, as I said, the vulva hangs directly over the head of certain of them, everywhere else it seems to have been sucked down, close to the circle of the horizon, and for the remaining regions, its altitude differs between the zenith and the horizon and always remains constant. Even so, the subvolvians have their own poles that are not among the fixed stars, where we have the poles in our world, but around other fixed stars which to us point to the poles of the ecliptics. In 19 lunar years, these poles cross small circles around the poles of the ecliptic in the constellation of Draco and their opposite, Xiphias and Passer and the Great Nebula. Since these poles are approximately to a quadrant of the vulva, the regions can be classified according to the poles and in relation to the vulva, resulting in an obvious advantage for them over us in this respect. For they indicate places in relation to their stationary vulva and latitude by both their vulva and the poles. This is different for us because there is no way to get our lengths except by the serval tilting of a hardly distinguishable magnetic needle. The vulva of the subvolvians remains stationary as if united with a nail to the heavens. Above it, other celestial bodies and the sun itself cross from east to west. There is no night in which none of the fixed stars in the zodiac will not hide behind this vulva, and once again emerge in the opposite region. Although not the same fixed stars do it every night, all those stars who are at a distance of 6 or 7 degrees from the ecliptic also take turns in this task. In 19 years, the entire circuit is completed, and each one of them is brought back to its original position. The vulva also doesn't increase more or less than our moon. The same cause exists for both cases: the presence of the sun or its departure. Its duration is also the same according to nature, but the subvolvians and we measure it by different methods. The subvolvians consider that a day and a night is the span of time during which all increases and decreases of the vulva are completed. We call this space of time a month. The vulva is rarely hidden from the subvolvians, even in new vulva, because of its size and brightness, and even more so in the case of the polar inhabitants lacking the sun at that time. For them, the vulva rotates its horns upwards at noon and in the intervulvan period. In general, for those who live between the vulva and the poles below the metavulvan circle, the new vulva is the signal of noon. The first quarter of night, the full vulva of midnight, and the last quarter brings the sun back. Those who observe the vulva and the poles located on the horizon live at the intersection of the equator with the divider, and their morning and evening come with full vulva, and their noon and midnight with the quarters. From these observations, we can draw conclusions about those who live among these places described above. The subvolvians distinguish the hours of the day by means of these and other phases of the vulva. So, for example, the closer they are to the sun and the vulva, the nearest noon is for the metavulvans, and night or sunset for those who live close to the equator. The subvolvians are much better equipped than we are to measure periods of night, which regularly last 14 hours, since in addition to that sequence of phases of the vulva, whose full vulva marks the middle of the night for the medivulva, the vulva itself serves them to distinguish the hours. Although the vulva seems in no way to change of place, contrary to our moon, it rotates and shows a surprising amount of marks and points that are constantly changing from east to west. When one of these marks returns after one of these revolutions, the subvulvians consider that they have spent an hour, equivalent to little more than one of our days and nights. This is the only uniform measure of time since, as we have indicated previously, the sun and the stars rotate daily around these lunar inhabitants in an irregular manner. This lack of uniformity is clearly revealed by the rotation of the vulva when compared to the distances of the stars to the moon. The upper section of the north vulva seems to have two halves, that is, one that is rather hidden, as if it were covered with continuous marks, and the other somewhat more clear, interpenetrated by a bright belt up north that serves as the dividing line of the two. The dark half is hard to explain. However, in its easternmost section we perceive something as the front of a human head cut off by shoulders, bending to kiss a girl dressed in a long robe, while the arm is extended backwards to try to capture a jumping cat. The wider and larger part is projected to the west, without a recognizable form. In the other half of the vulva, brightness extends more widely than the mark itself. It could be described as the image of a bell hanging from a rope and swaying towards the west. The upper and lower parts cannot be compared to anything. Besides distinguishing the hours of the day of the subvulvians in this way, the vulva gives them clear indications of the seasons of the year if proper attention is paid, or if recognition of the fixed stars is unknown to the observer. When the sun passes through Cancer, the vulva clearly indicates the north pole of its rotation. There is a small dark spot above the image of the girl, above the bright area. From the brightest and most remote part of the vulva, this point will move to the east, and from there it descends on the disk and it moves westward. The marks once again withdraw from the last position towards the east, towards the top of the vulva, and thus always remain visible. But when the sun enters Capricorn, this place cannot be seen, since the entire circle with its pole is hidden behind the body of the vulva. During these two periods of the year, the points move linearly to the west. During intermediate periods of Aries or Libra, these points sink across or climb in a crooked line. This fact shows us that while the center of the vulva remains at rest, the poles of this rotation evolve in an Arctic circle around the poles of the lunar inhabitants once a year. The most diligent observers are also aware that the vulva is not always the same size. During the hours of the day in which the heavenly bodies move quickly, the diameter of the vulva is much bigger, clearly 4 times larger than their moon. What can I say about the eclipses of the sun and the vulva? Levania's eclipses occur at the same time that eclipses of the sun and moon are seen here on Earth, but obviously for opposite reasons. When we see a total eclipse of the sun, their vulva is overshadowed, and in the same time when our moon is eclipsed, the sun is eclipsed for them. Even so, this correspondence is not absolute. They often see partial sun eclipses when a part of the moon is hidden to us. And on the contrary, they are often exempt from eclipses of the vulva when we have a partial eclipse of the sun. They have eclipses of the vulva in full vulva as well as we have our moon eclipses in full moon. They have new vulva eclipses of the sun as we have ours in new moon. Since they have long days and nights, they experience much more frequent eclipses of both celestial bodies. And as well as large numbers of our eclipses occur in our antipodes, their antipodes, since they are prevulvians, are not witness to any of them, while the subvulvians see them all. The subvulvians never see a total eclipse of the vulva, but a small point, reddish-brown, in its outline and dark in the center, crosses over them through the body of the vulva. This small spot makes its entrance in the eastern section of the vulva and disappears through the western edge, just as the natural points of the vulva, but surpassing them in haste. Its duration is extended to 1/6 of their hours, or 4 of ours. The cause of their solar eclipses is the vulva, as our moon is the cause of ours. This phenomenon is inevitable, taking into account that the vulva measures 4 times more than the sun. While the sun crosses from east through the south beyond the vulva on its journey to the west, it often remains hidden behind the body of the vulva. Although such disappearance is frequent, it is equally remarkable that it lasts several hours, and both the sun and the vulva are among the shadows at the same time. This is a great spectacle for the subvulvians, whose usual nights are not much darker than their days, due to the brightness and magnitude of their omnipresent vulva, while during the eclipse of the sun, both celestial bodies, the sun and vulva, remain hidden. Even so, their eclipses of the sun have the following peculiar feature. It frequently occurs that as soon as the vulva is hidden behind the sun, a brightness rises on the opposite side, as if the sun has expanded and embraced the whole body of the vulva, when, at other times, the sun seems much less voluminous than she. Therefore, complete darkness does not always ensue, until the centers of the bodies coincide closely, and the condition of the half-transparent medium is adequate. Nor, on the other hand, does the vulva disappear suddenly so that it cannot be discerned at all, although the sun sets completely behind it. The only exception occurs at the intermediate time of the total eclipse. At the beginning of such an eclipse, however, the vulva continues to be white in some sections of the divider, as if it were a coal once the flame has been extinguished. After this, whiteness disappears. The midpoint of the total eclipse has been reached, since it only disappears completely during this type of eclipse. When the whiteness of the vulva returns, in opposite places of the divider of the circle, the sun is closer to be seen. Thus, both bodies disappear in the middle of the total eclipse. These are the phenomena that happen in the 2 hemispheres of Laevania, the subvulvian and the prevulvian. From these considerations, it is not difficult to give an opinion, without my saying anything, on how the subvulvians and the prevulvians differ in many respects. A subvulvian night, even if it lasts 14 of our nights, lights up the surface and protects it from the cold by the presence of the vulva. A large mass like that, with so much glitter, cannot but keep the surface hot. On the other hand, although the subvulvian has the annoying presence of the sun along 15 or 16 of our days and nights, their sun is much smaller and does not have as much strength. The united luminaries attract all the water to this hemisphere until the surface has been completely covered, so very little of it stands out. On the contrary, when the water has been removed from the prevulvian hemisphere, it becomes dry and cold. However, when the night begins for the subvulvians and the day for the prevulvians, the celestial bodies are divided between both hemispheres, and thus water is divided. The subvulvian fields dry up, while water brings some rest from the heat for the prevulvians. The whole of Laevania extends no more than 1,400 German miles in circumference, a quarter of our earth. It has very high mountains and very deep and wide valleys, and consequently it is not comparable to our earth for its perfect roundness. The entire surface is porous, as if bored through hollow caverns and caves, especially frequent throughout the prevulvian hemisphere. These hollow places are the main way for the prevulvians to protect themselves against the heat and cold. Everything that springs from their lands or treads on it is of monstrous size. Increases in size are very fast. Life is short because all living things are huge body masses. The prevulvians have no fixed dwelling or home. In the space of a single day, they go across all of their world in hordes, following their receding waters using their legs, which are longer than a camel's, or by means of wings or boats. Should a delay of several days be necessary, they creep through the caves, depending on the nature of each of them. Most of them are divers, and they all breathe very slowly. They can take refuge in the bottom of the deep waters, combining nature with art. It is said that those who are in the depths of that water stand the cold, while the surface waves are streaming by the action of the sun. Those that remain on the surface are boiled by the midday sun and serve for food for the hordes of errant settlers. In general, the subvolvian hemisphere can be compared to our cantons, towns, and gardens, while the privolvian is similar to our fields, forests, and deserts. Those for whom breathing is essential take refuge in caves whose water supply is guaranteed by narrow channels that allow water to be cooled gradually during its long-distance voyage, and they use it for drinking. But when night comes, they go out for food. The bark of the trees, the skin of living beings, or anything else which takes its place occupy most of their corporeal mass, and it is porous and spongy. If any being is surprised by the heat of the day, its skin becomes hard and scorched, and falls during the night. Everything that springs out from the soil, on the mountain tops, grows and dies on the same day, making daily space for it to be replaced by new beings. In general, a serpentine nature is predominant. In a wonderful way, they expose themselves to the sun at noon, but always near the mouths of their caves, so that they can retreat quickly and safely. For some, the courage they have exhausted and the life they have lost by the heat of the day comes back again in the evening, in an opposite pattern to that which flies show here on earth. Here and there are scattered masses in the shape of pine cones. Their barks are fried by the sun during the day, but at night, when, so to say, they unfold their secrets, a multitude of living things come out of the hiding place they provide. In the subvolvian hemisphere, the clouds and storms are a special form of relief from the heat that often take over half or more of the region. It is at this point where the voice of the story changes from Duracotus back to Kepler. When I got to this part of my dream, the wind arose with a noisy rain that disrupted my rest, and, in the same time, deleted the end of one of the last books that I brought from Frankfurt. Therefore, leaving behind the daemon, the speaker, and Duracotus the son with his mother, Fioxhilda, the listeners, at the point in which their heads had been covered, I returned to my senses, only to find that my head was on a pad and my body wrapped in a blanket. As we come to the end of our story, I would like to make a few concluding remarks. First, as our protagonist in the story, Duracotus, is of Icelandic stock, I would share with you an Icelandic tradition, that of Jolabokaflod, or the flood of books. In this tradition, people give each other books on Christmas Eve, and then each person stays up late and reads their gift while eating chocolate. It may not surprise you to learn that my favorite gift to open early on Christmas Eve was a fantasy or science fiction novel, and so I feel I've come full circle with this episode. Perhaps you might share it with someone you know, along with a chocolate treat for them to enjoy over the hour or so of the episode. Second, the one other tradition my family would do each year was that after we went out for a meal together on Christmas Eve, we would then take the long route when driving home and admire all of the Christmas lights in the city I grew up in. As sentimental as I know it sounds, it was my favorite thing we would do each year. Christmas was a hard time for me growing up, but each year I would go out and find hope in the truth that at the time of year when the night was the longest, people would string up lights, in both ways, simple and elaborate, as sort of a way of holding back that length of night, that darkness, and saying to each person that there was room in their home for one more family. For those of you who may be spending this holiday alone, separated from loved ones, or in a difficult place, I wish I could have you all in my home. I'd love to talk to you about history, and philosophy, and science, and share a meal and possibly raise a glass. 2016 has been a rough year for a lot of us, but we've made it this far. The sun has gone as far south as it's going to, and is now turned back to the north in its yearly journey across the horizon. If you're interested, I'll be connected to my various social media accounts throughout the next couple of days. Drop in at our Facebook page and say hi. Find me on Twitter @ChadDavies and send me a tweet and I'll respond. Use the hashtag Scientific Odyssey and we'll be able to see each other and share the day. I hope you'll take a moment over the next few days and reach out and help create a community. Grace and peace to you all, and may you have a truly joyous holiday. Until next time, full sails on your journey.